Hey, Wendy.
Hi.
How are you? Okay, we're going to give participants just a couple more minutes to join us, and then we'll get started.
Great.
Can we give it just a couple more minutes? Want to be sure everybody has time to jump on today. And Wendy, will you let me know when you want me to share that goodie extra that you're bringing on today? Okay.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Okay, good. I'm so excited. I want to put it in now, but I'll wait.
Everybody be looking at that instead of the presentation.
Okay, that's true. That's true. Fair. Here we go. Okay, we're a couple minutes after noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm really, really excited about this month's webinar or roundtable, Zoom, whatever y'all are calling it out there. We are so excited to have Wendy Fong with us. I'm sure you all have seen her bio in our emails, but just to reiterate, she is founder of Chief Gigs, and you're going to hear about that in a little while, but I want you to understand her experience that she's bringing to the table today. It's amazing. She has over 20 years experience in culture change and leadership, and I would love to sit with her and talk all day. She has a lot of interesting things that she's doing as well in her personal life. I love that she is the chair for, okay, tell me if I say this wrong, Wendy, United Against Human Trafficking, which is fascinating and awesome, and what a wonderful work she does there. She's also a smarty. She has an MBA from Rice. So I hope she doesn't correct my grammar later. So no, she's really, really smart. She brings a lot to the table today. I know you guys are gonna love her and learn so much. And I hope everyone did their pre-work, because I did mine and it was eye-opening. So Wendy, I'm gonna go ahead and turn the mic over to you.
Great, perfect. I'm going to share my screen. Right now you should see a purple screen, and there's my title slide. Can you let me know if you see that? Okay, so just to start off, I want to make sure that everybody is, I'm pretty informal and I love interaction. So if you feel like chatting your answers, I'll be asking you to participate throughout the presentation. And so if you feel like chatting in your answers, that's great. If you feel like unmuting and speaking, that's great. As well as same with questions. I'm happy to entertain questions both ways. Okay, so just to get started, I am going to give you a little introduction about myself. So my name is Wendy Fong. I run a company called Chief Gigs, and I am a facilitator and speaker. I work with leaders to improve organizational effectiveness and achieve business results by aligning their people with their goals. It's that simple. Through my training programs, I advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in businesses and nonprofits. In fact, I have led close to 1,000 people in both small and large group settings virtually during the pandemic on critical topics such as leading in crisis, change management, unconscious bias, and systemic racism. As a result of my work, clients have been able to have more productive conversations and solve complex problems within their organizations, workplaces, and communities. On a personal note, my goal is to move to Cambodia to start a nonprofit when I retire. So I'm happy to talk about that too.
That is amazing. Yes, we will want to talk about that.
Thank you.
Amazing.
So you may wonder how I started doing this work. I have been, in corporate for most of my life. So I'll tell you a little story as part of my introduction. So in my last corporate job, I was hired as the vice president of operations. From the beginning, the people who interviewed me were very clear about how the industry was male, pale, and stale. Those are their words, not mine. And they wanted change. They said they wanted diversity, and I was a change maker that they wanted. And so this is, of course, the honeymoon phase, right? I felt like I had won the lottery. Who gets to, be hired into a company that actually wants you to be who you are, right? And so once I got in there and actually used my voice, I found the same resistance that many people of color or women find in the workplace. So as a veteran in operations, I go about fixing organizational issues systemically, and I didn't get the support for the issues that I needed to fix. In fact, leadership ignored the issues that I brought up many times, even though that's what they hired me to do. So when I saw this flowchart called The Problem Woman of Color, I was floored. It illustrated my very experience step by step. So from tokenism, like hiring, a person of color to bring about the change, to microaggressions, to the denial of racism and retaliation. And it all happened to me. And the beauty or, ugliness of it is that it's so ingrained that there's a flow chart that people go through. And this is your experience, right? So I was told that I was combative whenever we had conversations. And to be honest, I didn't realize I was going through all of these stages until after separation. And if you're wondering, I was fired for being the person that they wanted or that they said that they wanted. So that's how I started doing this work, so I can help company build inclusive environments for their employees. And if they don't, if they just want diversity without the inclusion, probably best not to even try it. So I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions so far, and feel free to unmute or just chat. Okay. All right. So we're going to, oh, here's a question. What would you do differently?
Yeah, good question.
That is a really good question.
Would you ask different questions in the interview phase? Because
You
I think we've
know,
all experienced that, where they say one thing and then they do another.
I don't think that they even knew. It's not, I always say, they're not bad people. We all live in a system, and they were doing, when someone threatens the system that you have, right? Where you're on top and someone comes in and threatens that, it's very natural for them to respond. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Could I have picked out? I mean, it was pretty obvious. So it was four white men, all senior VPs or the owners, right? And then me, the one woman of color, and then all of the worker bees, literally in the office. And so, four white men in their offices, me in my office, and the people. So it was like I was the conduit, right? So yes, could I have seen? I saw that, um, but I also thought that they wanted change, and I hired many people of color during my tenure there. And so it wasn't that they didn't want diversity. It's
They just
just
didn't want change.
when you're at a certain level, right? When you're at the VP level, when you're, at the senior level and you start um, changing the actual structure, that's the issue.
Okay.
So how long did it take me to move through this timeline from first hire to exit? A year. Yeah.
Just a year?
Yeah. Yeah.
So changing culture is really hard.
It is so hard.
Okay.
It is so hard. And I say that, diversity and inclusion is the biggest change effort you'll ever have in your
Okay.
organization.
Okay.
Yet, many times, companies have huge IT infrastructure and huge IT teams, right? To help you change from one product to another. Yet when you want to change the entire culture of the organization, they have maybe one person who's fully dedicated to DEI, right? Usually they're chief diversity officer. And then everybody else is volunteering on top of their other jobs to be part of this committee or task force.
Mm-hmm.
So, I do question when companies say we want change. How much do they want it, and how much money are they putting behind it?
Those are two great questions right there. That's should be asked right away. Okay.
Okay. So we started. Jennifer sent out an activity. And this is a discussion-based activity that guides participants in understanding privilege as a concept and recognizing the ways their own privileges benefit them and impact daily life. This is not about blame, shame, or guilt, and whether one is a nice person. So I want to make sure that there's no blame, shame, or guilt around this. And the fact that you have privilege doesn't mean that you're not a nice person. It's about observing, realizing, thinking systemically and personally. It's about seeing privilege. So that's the upside of oppression and discrimination. And it's about unearned advantage, which can be described as having an exemption from discrimination. If you feel or felt uncomfortable about some of these statements, that is absolutely the right response, because we don't talk about race every day. It is not something that everybody just wakes up and is like, oh, I'm ready to have difficult conversations. Initially, when this activity was created, it's done in person where you stand on the line, right? And the facilitator will read out each line, each statement, and then you move forward. And then by the end of it, you can visually see everybody who is all the way in the back and everybody who's moved up front. So since we can't do that virtually, I have put these categories. So if we can, again, type in the chat what your answer was for the activity, and then let us know. If I can have a volunteer who's willing to unmute, let us know what was the most shocking for you. What privileges did you find in your invisible knapsack that was shocking? So we have a 35.
I really probably could have answered 38.
Okay. Mine was in the 30s as well. 36. What was most shocking to you, Jennifer? Some of the statements that you read. Oh, you're muted.
I could just read them all to you, really. So spending time with anyone who I was trained to mistrust. Now, some of these as a woman, so I had to tell myself, don't answer as just a woman, answer as, your race. Some of these as a woman, but national heritage, about civilization.
Right.
I was born and raised in Oklahoma. So I was very cognizant or conscious of Indian, American Indian, but putting that on myself, I was like, wow, okay. And having a voice heard and not, there's just some, I could go through all of them. If I get pulled over in a traffic stop, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So.
Did we have any participants who had less than 30?
Probably not.
Okay. And anyone over 40? So it looks like we're all around the 30 to 40 range, which makes sense because many of the attendees are women in this call. So as you read through, I'm sure that some of the things that you read were shocking because they seem like a basic right to you. Some statements that was shocking, to me is, or can be, that I'd like to highlight is, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. That I can't do that, right? I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. And I know that seems really trivial. I'm going to tell you a little story actually that happened just this last weekend. So I have a friend, she is Chinese and her daughter's mixed race. So she is Chinese and white. And so her name's Rosie, and we were talking over breakfast. And I said something about her grandparents, and I said, are they Chinese? And she says yes. And I said, are you Chinese? And she said, no, I'm just regular. So, and I'm sorry, she's 3, just to give you that perspective, right? And so when you don't have the representation that you see, you really just want to be part of everybody else. You want to be part of regular because it's easier, right? Another one is I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily protection. And some of you may have heard about the talk that many Black parents have, or probably most Black parents have with their children. About, I had a conversation with my friend because his sons are the same age as my son, and his sons aren't allowed to wear hoodies. And you can understand why. Um, you know, they're tall Black kids who could look menacing in hoodies. And so he dresses them very, very well. Whereas my son is allowed to wear hoodies all the time. That's a privilege. And if you can imagine just the fact of wearing a hoodie is a privilege, that's what we're talking about here. So as we delve into discussion today, I want us to keep this knowledge in mind that we live in a society that provides advantages based on race. Your experience and your truth may not be the same experience and truth of the person sitting next to you, your coworker, your friends, other parents at your kids' schools, for example. And in addition to asking you to keep an open mind about advantages, I just like you to keep an open heart as well as we go into this discussion. Okay, and again, I'm happy if anybody has any additional thoughts about this exercise. Happy to entertain them in the chat.
I didn't think about the Band-Aids.
What do you think about them now in terms of just a 3-year-old saying that she's regular?
I love that. I think that should be a t-shirt. I just want to be regular. I mean, that is awesome. I wrote it down. I'm taking notes and I was like, that is amazing.
Yeah. And what regular means is just included, right? I just want to be included. I don't want to be singled out. And
right. Right. And how is that? I know you'll get into this, but how is that seeping into our workplace? Are we providing Band-Aids of all colors? Are we doing that with our clients too? I mean, what our experiences the same across the board? Are we trying to reach out? That's what I wrote down. How can we offer Band-Aids to everyone? So
okay, so we will delve into that.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started on some of the informational pieces. So there's no question that diversity wins when it comes to the financial performance of a company. This data is from an annual McKinsey study. It reaffirms the strong case for both gender diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity in corporate leadership year after year. So looking at the difference between the top quartile and the bottom quartile companies, in 2019, the top quartile for gender diversity on executive teams were 25% more likely to have an above average profitability than the bottom quartile. And then in the case of ethnic and cultural diversity, the top quartile companies were actually 36% more likely to have above average profitability than companies in the bottom quartile. And yet, using data from online reviews such as Indeed and Glassdoor, rather than employee engagement surveys, which may not be entirely transparent, McKinsey found that overall sentiment on inclusion was negative. So while the overall sentiment on diversity was 52% positive, sentiment on inclusion was markedly worse at only 29% positive and 61% negative. So this encapsulates the challenge that even the more diverse companies still face in tackling inclusion. So hiring diverse talent isn't enough. It's the workplace experience that shapes whether people remain and they thrive. Unfortunately, the brunt of this work falls on middle management. The job of being a middle manager has gotten so much harder through the pandemic, as well as the racial injustice that's happened in 2020. So more than ever, managers are dealing with the impact of social inequality magnified by a pandemic, and they're scrambling to support employees dealing with increased racial discrimination, those with mental health challenges made worse by stress and anxiety, or just really stressed out employees who can't take a vacation or go out to dinner to celebrate a win, to name a few. I usually define diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't have time today. So instead, I'll just share a few important notes. A person of color on their own cannot be diverse. So it often happens to people of color where they say, well, Wendy is diverse. Since I'm just one person, I cannot be diverse. I have my lived experiences. A group can be diverse or not diverse, but one person of color, they are underrepresented or marginalized, but I can't replace the diversity that comes with many people that make up a diverse group. So I can't speak for the Black community, LGBTQ community, or other marginalized groups. The harm comes when the burden of diversity falls on this one person. Their contributions to the organization needs to be more than that they just bring diversity. So it's really important to get that terminology right. Secondly, diversity is much tougher to manage than a homogenous group. And we know we can do better financially with diversity, which I showed earlier, but people don't talk about how much harder it is to manage more diversity in our organizations. We don't talk about the challenges it brings your day-to-day work. It's much easier to have 20 people who have the same lived experiences. When you're lacking diversity and you're a homogenous group, you can build consensus pretty quickly. And there might not be as much conflict and as much difference of opinions. So when we say we will invest in diversity, we care about diversity, you have to know that diversity creates more room for conflict, misunderstandings, cross-cultural challenges, more people who don't share, which creates difficult conversations. And that's happening in our offices now, where when there's diversity, we can't ignore what's going on outside our office walls, right? So it takes a lot of skill and intentionality to manage this. So hiring diversely without the culture of inclusion creates harm for underrepresented people, like in my introduction. So this is a great or simple way to remember it. Diversity is having a seat at the table. Inclusion is having a voice. And belonging is having that voice heard. So now that we have some terms squared away, let's look at structures that are in place. So here, and this is actually a really great graphic, here on the top left, you see inequality, right? And you see that, this tree is leaning to the left, and the person on the left has more apples than the one on the right because they're growing more. So, what equality means is I am going to provide evenly distributed tools and assistance. So, in this graphic, they both got little, bags to hold their apples and the same ladder at the same height. But there's still inequality here because there's more apples on the left. And so the person on the right does still not um, does not have equal access to the apples. On the bottom left, that's equity, custom tools that identify and address inequality. So here, and the person on the right got a higher ladder. They're now able to reach the apples, but you see that structurally, there's still more apples on the left. That's where they grew. So justice is really about fixing the system and offering equal access to both tools and opportunities. So here, we have equal opportunities to an equal number of apples. Do you have any questions on these terms here and what they mean?
What's the goal? Equity and justice in the workplace?
Yeah,
Okay.
justice is really the goal.
Okay.
So justice is that everybody can be regular, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So with the current administration and DEI, Blakeman and Associates had asked me to speak a little bit about that. You can see that they've done quite a few things, and some of them are system related. So they're trying to, they're getting to the justice part. Some of them are just about equity. So right now, for example, every federal agency was tasked on the first day of this administration to review its programs and deliver an action plan within 200 days to address any disparities in policies and programs. We don't know what they'll do with this action plan or if the review is even going to be complete, right? And so we're not sure what that looks like. But for example, with immigration, reversing the Muslim ban, committing to counting undocumented people in the census, and reaffirming DACA, that's actually a structural change. With the housing, HUD will take necessary steps to redress racially discriminatory federal housing policies that have contributed to wealth inequality and for generations, such as redlining. and access to funding. And then you mentioned the tribal nations earlier. So the administration has committed to respect tribal sovereignty and strengthen nation-to-nation relationship between the US and tribal nations. That would be something that we don't know what if that's a structural change or if it's, um, just talking, right? So, okay. So talking about your own organization, as I review these, try to determine where your organization is on the continuum for racial equity. So on the left side, there is a place that's colorblind. It's a one size fits all. The organization tends to think that what's good for everyone will necessarily be good for people of color. It does not lift up issues of equity, diversity, and it takes a position that paying attention to this topic diverts attention away from shared concerns. Moving near the middle are companies with a decided and deliberate emphasis on diversity, recognizing it offers value to the workplace, but only that. Further to the right are those organizations who find data showing racial disparities troubling. They know something needs to be done, yet they're not really sure about how to act systemically on that concern. They may take a step or two forward, but are afraid of doing it wrong. And then finally, there is the racial equity approach. This organization recognizes that all programmatic and operational functions must be race informed in order to advance the overall organizational mission for everyone. So the goal for your organization is not to be colorblind. Race was invented hundreds of years ago, and structures and policies haven't been built around it. So we can't just undo it by saying we don't believe in race, we don't see color, we treat everybody the same. Because how can you possibly fix something that you don't believe you see? So I, as a person of color, need you to see color so that you can acknowledge my different experience. So Jennifer, you mentioned human trafficking earlier. Thank you for introducing that. So I'll use human trafficking as an example. So in human trafficking, once you know that it exists, you're either for human trafficking, which means that you support the criminals who enslave people, or you're against it, which means you are anti-human trafficking. There's really no neutral ground. Once people know that human trafficking exists, they feel some way about it. They definitely feel one way or the other, and mostly it's anti-human trafficking, right? And so it's the same with racism. And that's what it means when they say anti-racist. It's that once you understand that it exists and you understand that structures have been in place, to promote racism, then you really are, you do definitely have feelings about it. So for you to move your organizations to the right, this work must be rooted in anti-racism ideology. And remember, this change will not be quick or easy. Sometimes it's a squiggly line with U-turns, but we want to make sure that we're making progress towards the right. So Jennifer, this is when you drop the document into the chat for all of the attendees. So there's a much more comprehensive assessment tool that you can employ at your organization to determine your racial equity readiness. And it's a tool, it's a PDF that Jennifer is dropping into the chat so that you have access to it. It's a free tool, and you may do it yourself. I am happy to work with your organization to assess it. But this is a much more comprehensive tool than what we just went over. Okay. So while we're doing that, remedies to inequity must include 3 aspects to be effective. So they must be systemic. Systemic solutions address root issues by transforming the way systems create and perpetuate racial and equitable outcomes. This often plays out at the level of institutions through formal policies or unwritten practices or dominant culture. So systemic solutions shift the focus from individual or interpersonal acts of racism to larger patterns of unequal treatment and outcomes for the people of different races. 2, it must be race explicit. So being race explicit allows change agent to be specific about the strategic types of solutions that they're deploying. So using the R word, such as race, racism, racial disparities, racial equity, it increases awareness among staff, focuses goals and planning, and then specifies success measures. So too often proxies such as class or education level are used as more comfortable explanations for the disparate outcomes. So we must really name structural racism when it is at play in order to design solutions to mitigate against it. And then lastly, it must be outcome oriented. So equal opportunities are not the same as equitable outcomes. We saw that with the apples, right? So just because they had the same height ladder, it doesn't mean that the two people had access to equal outcomes. And so though opportunities may seem equal, if disparate outcomes persist, it is likely that there's still some barriers or bias. And so equity takes into account the wide-reaching and ongoing impact of structural racism, and the impact that it has on people's lives, and then provides targeted support to rectify those impacts. So we imagine a workforce, a workplace where despite the structural barriers that they face, in order for workforce development practitioners to succeed, they really absolutely have to have access to being able to make systemic changes in a race explicit way and be able to measure the outcome. So there are 3 steps that you can action today. So 1 is hiring and promotion practices. 2 is adding champions of DEI within and outside of your organization on your performance evaluations. And then 3 is creating a management accountability structure. And I will go through each one fairly quickly so that we have time for questions. So in order to attain a racially inclusive and equitable workforce, first, we must track internal demographic, right? And define targeted goals to attract diverse applicants. When we hire, many times we use outdated job descriptions or someone who is currently doing, have someone who's currently doing the job in mind, or we hire based on our network. So who has friends who would also like to work here? And of course, if we do that, we're hiring the same people. So we're not looking objectively at what the role actually requires. So using behavioral assessments can help mitigate bias. I use a tool called Predictive Index. It's not specifically designed for DEI purposes, but they help promote inclusion by providing objectivity. So you can objectively match the right person to the right job, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender, and inspire a diverse range of perspectives. So I'll talk a little bit about how that works. So I am a I am a predictive index consultant, but personally I use PI tools for my hiring as well. So to begin, you must start with an objective job targeting process. So if I were to hire for a COO, for example, for the nonprofit that I chair, we may send a questionnaire to the current CEO, to some other people who, some board members, as well as people who would be reporting to this position. And we would ask them, what kind of person should be in this role? Are they a collaborative person, or do they need to be more independent? Will they be representing the company? And will they need to be persuasive? Will they need to concentrate on tasks for long periods of time? And over the series of questions, it creates the software actually creates a profile that tells us who we're looking for. And because we have a diversity of input, right? We've asked multiple people to give input. We're not really just, having one person say, hey, this is the kind of person I'm looking for. So we're looking at a role much more objectively. And then as you prepare your job post, you may also want to ensure that job requirements are inclusive. For example, it's no longer necessary to have lifting 40-pound boxes for 8 hours a day if there's automation that assists, right, in lifting boxes. And then ensure that nice to haves are not limiting. So, for example, you may currently only recruit from Ivy League universities where there's already a racial equity. There is not racial equity in the process of entering and graduating from one of those institutions. And so making sure that we look at our job description, look at our recruitment practices to promote racial equity. So next, once you've posted your job, you can send all of the candidates a link to take the predictive index assessment, which takes about 5 minutes to complete. So this is an automatic step in my process. So prior to reviewing any resumes, I'm not even looking at names, so that helps prevent bias. Once the candidates take the assessment, you'll see each applicant's behavioral match with your job profile. And so instead of reviewing hundreds of resumes, you'll actually have the ability to quickly identify whether or not a candidate is the right fit. That is, if you have, so here you can see visually that the orange bars is where I said, this is a person that I'm looking for. Someone who's collaborative, who is more on the reserve side, but definitely steady and precise. And then the ABCD is actually the overlay of what a candidate looks like overlaid against the target. And so it's important to be able to see this. And here you can see where there's actually job match scores. And so and I again do this before I even look at any names, any sort of, where the person went to school and so forth to prevent bias. And I have a policy. So it's best practice to have a policy about how you interview and how you recruit. And so my practice is that I am going to have screening interviews with all 9 and 10 out of 10 matches, regardless of how many people there are. And lastly, here you can see that in this example, this candidate doesn't exactly match, right, who I'm looking for behaviorally. And so we can actually have questions that the software provides for you to figure out areas that are misalignment. And so it's a common language that's not based on anything other than behavioral factors. And then lastly, let's say I have hired, so this is actually my manager development chart. So let's say I've hired Wendy as your manager. This tells Wendy that, one of her strengths is that she drives change and challenges status quo. But one of the cautions is that I may be seen as overly aggressive by direct reports. So again, this manager strategy guide helps encourage empathy. It improves internal communication because my manager can have this very, very objective conversation with me, and it fosters greater understanding. Any questions on this?
How can we institute this if we're a small business without killing our budget, breaking our budget for new hires?
Yeah, so this is actually a subscription-based tool. And so it's based on how many employees you have, not how many assessments you send out. Some
Okay.
assessments are a certain amount, $100 per assessment, for example. And so you don't want to send it to 100 candidates, right? You want
Right.
to shortlist it. And because the way this is created, we want to make sure you send it to every candidate. It's not based on how many tests that are taken. So, and I'm happy to, I will actually offer for all of the attendees to be able to take an assessment at the end of our session, which you can email out the link to them. And so if you want to find out more about PI, happy to talk about that. Okay, but I need to move on. So secondly, add champions of diversity, equity, and inclusion to your core competency. And actually, I know that sounds easy because it's just adding something to your core competency, but this is actually the hardest of the 3 steps. It takes a great deal of dedicated time, intentionality, and leadership to support achieved inclusion. So one DEI training is not a panacea. In fact, there's plenty of research that shows a lack of positive results for bias and diversity training. So what I'm suggesting here is not, hey, everybody takes a course, on diversity, and then you now are a champion of DEI, right? It really needs to be infused into the very fabric of your culture. So for example, so what we have here is, 3 levels of core competency. And the ultimate goal is to create an inclusive environment that's free of hostility, toxicity, and adverse impacts to marginalized identities. So this is actually adapted from Annie E. Casey's Foundation's Advancing the Mission. And here, if we look at level 1, it's really all of the training around bias, around privilege, and getting comfortability around the issues of race, class, power, and other forms of oppression. And so, we want level 1 employees to have an understanding of what microaggressions are and the ability to actively call them out if they see or hear it. So for example, if you had a client ask me, or actually let's say this, if Jennifer, I'm your client, and you ask me, where are you from? And I'll say, I'm from Alabama. And you say, no, where are you really from? Right? And that's actually a microaggression. So as your colleague, they may pull you aside and say, hey, Jennifer, let me tell you why that is problematic. You are making our client feel like, they don't belong here, right? They're always an other because you can visually tell that ethnically they're not quote unquote from here, even though there are many Asians who've been here for generations. So that's the level 1 core competency. Level 2 would be the ability to do that. Plus, they'll be able to apply an equity lens to reveal biases in an issue or situation, as well as help develop others on their journey. And then level 3, lastly, we want employees who will be able to serve on your employee resource groups, for example, as well as task force, right? So we really want employees to be able to infuse an equity lens over areas of work and points of discussion across the organization. And we want them to be able to apply a clear analysis of embedded racial inequities and accumulated advantage and disadvantage, so privilege and racism, to the work of the organization at large or to a specific program or unit. And the reason we want this level is because we want them to be able to participate in the 3rd step, which is to create a management accountability structure. So when individuals making decisions do not represent the population, we can inadvertently create policies that have adverse impacts or unintended consequences towards a marginalized group. And even when the course of action is equitable, leaders administering it can choose to create can choose to treat certain groups differently, right? So oftentimes we don't look critically enough at policies and procedures to ensure equity. So equal opportunity, I said earlier, is not the same as equitable outcome. Though opportunities may seem equal, if disparate outcomes persist, then barriers or bias continue to exist. So I'll actually give you an example of this famous case of Yiquo versus Hopkins in 1886. So this is a long time ago. And this was the first case where the Supreme Court ruled that a law that is race neutral on its face, but is administered in a prejudicial manner is an infringement on the Equal Protection Clause. So in this case, in San Francisco, the city had denied laundry operation licenses to all Chinese applicants, but granted licenses to all but one non-Chinese laundry operators who applied. So law enforcement officials arrested more than 100 people for operating laundries without licenses, every one of them being Chinese. So the Supreme Court unanimously overturned the convictions of 2 Chinese men who were operating laundries without a license. And they declared, though the law itself be fair on its face and impartial in appearance, yet if it is applied and administered by public authority with an evil eye and unequal hand, so as practically to make it unjust and illegal discriminations between persons in similar circumstances, then denial of equal justice is still within the prohibition of the Constitution. Bringing this back to your organization, this also happens in companies, right? Let's say you have a 20,000 person organization. Can you be sure that let's say you have a structure for advancement where managers are able to mark employees as ready for advancement? Can you be sure that everyone is doing it equally, right? Or that there is not any discrimination in that advancement process? So here, that's what a management accountability structure is, right? Our current system puts a great deal of pressure on employees to advocate for their own needs. We rely on employees to speak up, to tell us when something isn't working for them. So there's never really been, hey, let me take a look at our, our system and see, what issues there might be. It's usually when people complain that they haven't been able to advance that the issue is looked at. And it's looked at on a case-by-case basis as opposed to systemically. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we can create some accountability by creating a task force to review policies and structures to ensure that they are equitable. So how this works is you would have task force members who are level 3 employees, and they could be trained to use racial equity impact assessments like this. So this is an example of a racial equity impact assessment. To systemically examine how groups will likely be affected by a proposed policy or decision. So ideally, these assessments can be conducted during the decision-making process for new policies. It would be extremely helpful for the task force to examine current problematic policies as well, known to create disparate outcomes. So again, this is a assessment that I'm showing here is one from Race Forward, which is a nonprofit. And these assessments can be used to anticipate, assess, and prevent potential adverse consequences. And I know I'm nearing the end, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So to be truly inclusive, this means that we've hired all of these different people and they feel safe and supported to voice their opinions. So psychological safety is when you have 20 people in a room, 19 people believe one thing, and the one person feels comfortable to express that they do not, without the fear of retaliation. And if you don't have that culture, how do you benefit from diversity? So this is truly the only way to reach the full benefit of diversity, right? Because we want diversity of ethnicities, of cultures, of thought. So, let's, think through how do you know if your employees feel psychologically safe? You can observe meetings to see if there are frequent disagreements or if the same few people take up all of the real estate in the room. You can use tactics like sharing an agenda in advance and having people submit anonymous ideas in advance, or for people who might be a little more reserved, to have a conversation with them beforehand, to ask them for their contribution in a way that's comfortable for them. But this is a way for you, no matter where you are in an organization, perhaps you are not able to make these sweeping changes, but this is a way for you to start with your own team. Okay. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. There's a lot of organizations wanting to do the right thing, but they might not know what to do. DEI is an area that external help is really useful. Sometimes there are career impacting limitations when you speak up about diversity and inclusion within an organization. And so I have a 3-part series, and it can be booked one at a time or separately. And the first workshop deals with personal bias and privilege. It's very introspective, and includes tactics on how to approach difficult conversations, but also how to apologize when we mess up, because we definitely will. The second delves deeper into diversity, equity, inclusion, systemic racism, current events, and how we can start to affect change on a personal level. And then the third workshop is really geared towards leaders like the one we have today, in looking more deeply into the tools that I've shared today. So I also have a slide with learning resources that I'll leave with you. So when you're learning, reject the desire to ask people of color to explain racism for you. Instead, use these resources created by people of color to help educate yourself, or offer financial compensation to people of color for educating you. One example is Rachel Cargill of The Great Unlearn. It's actually a membership that you can join to receive weekly education. And then before I end, this is a great quote. No matter how inclusive we are working towards being, we can always do more and we can always do better. So I know I left very little time for questions, but I'm happy to open it up. And if I don't know, Jennifer, if we have a few extra minutes, if we have questions, we can go over.
Yeah, I don't have any here that have come in yet. So if you guys want to type them in or ask them, this is your time with Wendy. So take advantage. I love that quote, by the way.
I do too.
You've given us so much to think about how we can do this in our organization. I feel a little overwhelmed. On that last slide with those ideas that you're giving us, would you say that's something that we should do across our organization? Like start introducing these things. Hey, have you read this or you talked about that? I mean, what?
So it really depends on whether you're comfortable having these conversations in your organizations, right?
Okay.
So I think just following people on Instagram is really great, because it's small tidbits of information and they're conversation starters. So definitely.
That's a great idea.
If any of you, here are some of my book recommendations. And if any of you are parents, reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates was amazing. I couldn't put it down, and I read it all in one sitting because it talks, the author actually, kind of goes through his feelings of raising a Black son, right, in this world. And it was extremely engaging, extremely well written, and it definitely drew the reader in.
I wrote it down.
Okay.
Maggie has a question.
Yes. So while race was the major topic today, can these changes be successful in gender bias as well? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if we don't talk about it, it's not happening, right? And so understanding that there is, a huge, obstacle for women as well. I know as a woman of color, I've been in a room, I've spoken up, and people seem to have not heard me. And then a white colleague would say the same thing, and it would be really well received. What this white colleague could have done, this white male colleague could have done, was to actually amplify my voice instead of repeating what I said. So how that happens is, oh, like Wendy said, or I really like what Wendy suggested, and then to repeat, right? As opposed to just repeating what I said without crediting the author.
Do you think there's any point to where people can't change by our age or how we were raised? I mean, I'm just trying to think of the workplace and how we can change, like the people that are going to be most resistant. Do you see it's an age gap? Is it a culture? I mean, what is that?
So the tools that I share here are more structural. So I'm not saying everybody has to change immediately.
Okay.
But when we change the structure of how we recruit, nobody actually has to change, right? This is how we recruit. All of a sudden, you have candidates that look and feel very different from the usual candidates. But it was a structural change. I'm not, asking you to change who you are immediately. That takes time. But if you can do little things like the structural change, it's easy to implement. Blinded resumes, group interviews.
So just start with those things. Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions? We are 1 minute over, but Wendy is graciously going to stay if you have any other questions. And remember, if you have questions that come up later, I'll include Wendy's email or you have her website. You have her way of contacting her.
I have my contact information.
Yes. Feel free to reach out to her and ask her directly any of these things. Her tools are amazing. So look at those for your organization as well.
Yeah, and I will follow up with a link for all of the attendees to be able to take the predictive index. I will send you your report and have a 30-minute conversation with you free of charge. That's my offer for all of the attendees today, to discuss your results so that you can be a more aware and inclusive leader.
That's amazing. Everybody take advantage of that today. Okay, we'll send that out. Any closing thoughts?
Just want to thank everybody for, I know that this is not an easy topic, and so there might not be as much interaction, which definitely have experience, but I really appreciate everybody being here, being open to listening to me about this topic. And I definitely encourage you to check out some of the tools that I've shared.
Thank you so much, Wendy. You have definitely given us a lot to talk about. Yep. I'm sure that people will be contacting you soon, and I can't wait to use that link that we will share. That's amazing. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your time today. We learned so much.
You are welcome. Have a great day.
And everyone, we're going to have our next roundtable the second Thursday of May. We're going to talk about heat stress and getting ready for the summer. So look for information about that. We're excited to roll that out and get ready for the hot Texas summer. And Wendy, thanks again so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks.